The Green Line really did connect northern Kentucky. So if you think of Covington as being the center of the wheel, so to speak, and then there were these tentacles that kind of went out from it. So the first line actually went to Newport. The second line went to Dayton. And then they started expanding further out. So Ludlow received theirs in 1893, so a line went into Ludlow and Bromley. Fort Thomas received one in the 1890s. Latonia actually had a mule car in the 1880s, which was transferred over to electric to supply transportation to the racetrack. In 1867, we see the first mule and horse-drawn vehicles on the streets of Covington. Which was not coincidental, and that year was the year that the suspension bridge started going. And so you start seeing transportation going back and forth between Ohio and Kentucky. And immediately the streetcar company laid tracks across the suspension bridge into Ohio. So there was transportation going back and forth. By the 1890s, the mules and horses were being replaced by electric streetcars. Most of those mule-drawn cars were in Covington and Newport, the earlier lines. When they started expanding out into northern Kentucky, so when they expanded into Fort Mitchell, when they expanded into Ludlow, into Fort Thomas, into Latonia, they were using electric. So it was, by the 1890s, they were switching over from the horse-drawn, mule-drawn cars to electric cars. And so that was the first big advancement. And I think it's very interesting if you look at the streetcar system in northern Kentucky in general. Almost every line had something at the end of the line. The Green Line was a private company. And so the Green Line was in the business of making money. And so the more riders they could get onto the vehicle at any particular time, on the car at any particular time, was the more money they made. So at the end of the Bellevue-Dayton line was Tacoma Park. At the end of the Fort Thomas line was the fort. At the end of the Rosedale line was Rosedale Swimming Pool. At the end of the Dixie Highway line, the line that I think most people still remember, was several restaurants and an entertainment area. So Stevie's Cafe was at the end, and Edelweiss Gardens, which is now known as the Greyhound Grill, or the Greyhound Tavern. Those two were the anchors at the end of the Fort Mitchell line. And at Ludlow, the end of the line was the Ludlow Lagoon Amusement Park. So the amusement park was at the end of the Ludlow line. And interestingly enough, the main owners of the Street Railroad Company were also the main owners of the Lagoon Amusement Park. And so they were developing a park that would bring people into Ludlow using their streetcar system, especially on nights and weekends when ridership was low. So, you know, during the week when people were going back and forth, that line was very busy. On the weekends before the lagoon, not so much. But once the lagoon opened, people were coming in droves on weeknights and weekends to go to the park. And when you think about it, this was the heyday of the streetcars was before automobiles became affordable for most people. So people were using public transportation much more than they do today. 1900, for instance, there were 14 million people that used 14 million rides, basically, that year on the Green Line. Think about the number of people using the Green Line for getting back and forth to work, for getting to wherever they needed to be. It was the major mode of transportation. The numbers of people getting on and off not only were large, and not only were they crowded, but it also could be dangerous, because at a time, you know, you had horse and buggies competing with the streetcars, and then later you had automobiles competing with the streetcars. And so that conductor's job was very important also in making sure that people were getting on and off the trolley safely, especially in the downtown areas where there was a lot of traffic. It was a very effective and very efficient form of transportation, but it was always crowded. They were packing them in, you know, as many people they could get into the car as possible. Of course, we didn't have OSHA, we didn't have the safety standards we have today, and so it was even, you know, more likely that people were, you know, if that was the car and they were going to be late, they were going to find a spot on that car, so they'd jump on. And there were basically two different kinds of cars. One was a 35 passenger car, which was the majority of the cars. About 200 cars were on the Green Line at any given time. And usually had a director who steered basically, or made sure that the car stayed on the track, and a conductor. And the conductor stood at the back and collected fares and announced stops. In 1917, the Green Line bought about 25 larger vehicles. The larger vehicles held about 50. And so they also had a brakeman on them. So the brakeman actually made sure that the larger vehicles actually could stop where they needed to stop.
So we're here today in the parlor car, Kentucky. It was a very special car run by the Green Line, and it's one of the few remaining streetcars in the country. It was originally built as a conventional streetcar in the 1890s and converted to a parlor car, which was a more gracious social car. So we have these wicker chairs in a very convivial, convenient, pleasant environment. These cars were used for the executives for special outings, and people could rent these cars for family or group outings. They could go to Latonia Racetrack or to Lagoon Park in Ludlow and just rent one of these cars for the day. This is a very rare streetcar. There are one of the few left in the United States.
The streetcar schedule was very important because basically the streetcar was there for two purposes. One was to get people back and forth to work, and the other was to get them to recreational activities. The schedule was a very definite schedule, just like a bus schedule would be today. They did not run 24 hours a day, but they did run a very long period during the day because Northern Kentucky, especially in the early 1900s, late 1800s, was very industrial. So a lot of manufacturing jobs, and people were working on multiple shifts. So when you think of today, the bus running for different shifts, the streetcar was doing the same thing. So it was important to make sure that people were getting to work. If you're going from Covington into Newport on the 12th Street Bridge, on your right-hand side you'll see a very large brick, looks like an industrial building. It's actually the original car barn for the Green Line system. So the streetcars, if they needed service, if they needed upgrades, if they were being stored and not being used, they would go to the car barn, and that's where repair work was done, that's where upkeep was done. Offices for the Green Line were also, some of the offices were located there as well. So that's one of the last few remaining elements of the streetcar line that still exists, and ironically it's not a streetcar and it's not rails, it's a physical building.
I'm Chuck Eilerman, and I'm a descendant of the Eilerman family that had the big clothing store at Pike and Madison in downtown starting in the 1890s. And that, of course, was part of the system of the streetcars. Streetcars made urbanization and shopping and business possible in Covington, particularly in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, before the rubber-tired vehicles, automobiles and buses came along. It's reflective not only the 43,000 people that were in Covington in 1900, and how that dense city functioned only by virtue of having streetcars, because people going to and from work, going shopping, going to market, going to schools, the high schools, La Salette, Notre Dame, and Covington Catholic, Ville Madonna College, the hospital, the doctor's offices, the shopping, even the markets. There were not only big markets at 6th Street and 11th Street, but there was a big Findlay Market type market house on 7th Street. So those were the big markets, and people throughout the city came along the streetcar just to shop for food, like they went to Findlay Market. So the streetcar is indispensable, particularly in the 10s and 20s.
In 1921, the Dixie Terminal was built, which was a huge event. It was covered in the newspapers locally almost on a daily basis. It was a 9-story building, still standing in downtown Cincinnati, of course, right at the foot of the suspension bridge. And so streetcars would basically funnel into Covington. They would cross the suspension bridge and would enter the Dixie terminal on several different levels, depending on the routes that they were going. Then passengers could get on or off and switch to the streetcars that were going into Cincinnati, or if you were coming back, switch on to the streetcars going into northern Kentucky. But the Dixie Terminal was Art Deco. It was a beautiful building, had a wonderful arcade with a beautiful arch ceiling, just a really high quality artistic building. But it was also extremely functional. At the height of its operation, every 45 seconds there was a streetcar coming in and out of that building. So the constant travel of people going back and forth between Cincinnati and northern Kentucky was fantastic. It's truly a magnificent building and stood the test of time. No longer, of course, used for transportation, but it was a huge part of culture in Cincinnati and northern Kentucky.
The city of Covington was the primary beneficiary of the streetcars up until the 20s and 30s. And only then were the suburbs, the streetcar suburbs like Park Hills and Fort Mitchell developed, largely because the streetcar ran out through them.
So the Fort Mitchell line, for instance, allowed people of more modest means, so middle class, upper middle class folks, to move out into Park Hills, into Fort Wright, into Fort Mitchell, and be able to take a streetcar down to Covington to work and then back home from work. And even education, because, the schools weren't as developed in those areas in those early days. And so people, children could be put on the streetcar like a school bus in some ways and go to Covington, go to school, especially if they were in a private school, or if a public school didn't exist in their neighborhood. And then when school was over, get back on and come home.
My mother grew up at the corner of Beechwood and Dixie Highway, and she'd tell me stories about, riding on the Green Line. She used to tell me her brothers used to jump on and off the Green Line, and they'd get mad because they didn't pay.
And I think it's really interesting. If you were living in Fort Mitchell, Fort Wright before churches were built, for instance, people were going to their congregations in Covington. So you would hop on the trolley on Sunday morning and you would go down the hill to Covington. So early residents of Park Hills and Fort Wright, for instance, Catholics in particular, before there was a Catholic church out in the suburbs, were going to St. John or St. Aloysius. So you would hop on a trolley, you would go down the Dixie Highway, you'd hop off the trolley at St. John, or if you wanted to go to St. Aloysius or St. Pat's, you could go either way depending on if you were German or Irish. We think about all the things that are in the suburbs today. When you think about when the suburbs were developed, they were primarily housing. And they really wanted it to be that way. They had small business districts, but they were designed communities to be bedroom communities. They weren't designed to be working class cities, like Covington was, or Ludlow, or Newport, or Bellevue. And so the zoning became very important for those early suburbs to make sure that they were remaining residential. So many of those individuals who were living out there were doing their shopping in Covington. There were small stores in the suburbs, but if you wanted to go to a department store, for instance, you had to go to Covington, you had to go to Newport, you had to go to Cincinnati. And so those streetcars were making that access to business available to people who otherwise might not have that ability, especially if they didn't own an automobile at that point.
So I'm very passionate about the Green Line trolley. I think it was what makes Fort Mitchell very unique. One of the things that Fort Mitchell has is we have St. John's Cemetery, St. Mary's Cemetery, and Highland Cemetery. 3 large cemeteries, and that's how people came up to their loved ones. What followed that is churches. We have the Catholic Blessed Sacrament Church and the Baptist Church, Fort Mitchell Baptist Church, and people came on the Green Line to go to church services also. So not only their loved ones. And the Green Line moved end of the line locations. It used to be right where Kroger's is, and Lewin's Monument was because it ended at the cemeteries. And then it went further, and then what everybody knows at it today is the end of the line, which was at Greyhound Tavern. And so Greyhound has a long history of being a restaurant, and it's changed to a family friendly. And back in the day, there was a bookie parlor in the back.
The streetcar did have some problems with the terrain in northern Kentucky, particularly getting up the hill. So, you see Covington in the basin, and they were trying to get up the hill to Fort Mitchell, particularly. The Fort Mitchell line was problematic in some ways. And so you'll see where it's basically following the Dixie Highway south, but there are a number of places where it had to divert from the Dixie Highway. There wasn't enough median on the side of the road to be able to do a streetcar. And they did not want to put it down the center of Dixie Highway because it was a major artery. And so you'll see where it diverts in Park Hills, several places actually in Park Hills. It actually goes over Sleepy Hollow Road at one place with a trestle. So they had to build similar to a railroad trestle, but on a smaller scale. When it gets out towards Old Fort Mitchell, the Old Fort Mitchell neighborhood, it's running parallel to Dixie Highway, but a little bit off of Dixie Highway.
Approximately right at I-75, it actually started to go towards Mercedes-Benz, where Mercedes is, and we actually own a park. It's a green space, Iris Park. It's the corner of Iris and Fort Mitchell Avenue. The reason the city has that park is because it was the trolley line. And then there's also a trolley bridge as you go back, down Iris. There's actually still green space. There's an old steps, and the steps that are on the back of Ridge Avenue was a trolley stop. And why would it stop there? Is because of the country club. The country club and St. John Cemetery were both right there, very predominant for a stop for them. And that's some of the oldest parts of Fort Mitchell, and the original Fort Mitchell was right there, and that was an original stop on Ridge.
In the 20s in particular, Fort Wright was booming. Fort Mitchell was developing. Park Hills was booming. And so the need for mass transit into those areas was high enough, and there were enough people living in those areas that this private company was willing to invest money because they knew they would make it back. So they were making a smart business decision. So that construction that they did paid off in the long run. The remnants really of the streetcar system, particularly in Kenton County, are few and far between. Trolley Park is the most identifiable one in Park Hills. The original stone pavilion where you would wait for cars either going to Covington or coming from Covington still stands in Trolley Park. So that's a real interesting piece of that history.
D. Collins Lee, the founder of Park Hills, he had a strong aesthetic point of view. And he had his architects, Dayglow and Henthorne, design these buildings to reflect the neo-Tudor style that is very prevalent in Park Hills. The buildings are stone. At the corners, they indicate the stop. But you'll see each of these buildings has a window, and that window is on the west side. The window breaks the west wind for the person who's waiting for the trolley. And if you see the little railing over there, that is composed of trolley tracks. The two holes that you see jutting forth here originally held two poles that held a sign that identified the trolley stop. Now, when the trolleys quit running, these were for many years bus stops. I mean, I myself use this as bus stops, but the bus no longer takes this route. So this is a charming example of a personal trolley stop. These little gates are all along the streetcar path, and a person could be picked up at their home and dropped off at their home, and they'd have a little place to wait, a little sheltered from the weather. But it'd be almost like having a chauffeur. You just get dropped right in the backyard. And something people forget about the trolley lines is it was silent. It was electric. You would have heard all this beautiful bird noise. It was very quiet. So we are at the intersection of Lawton Road and Audubon Road, where a third streetcar stop sat in style identical to the ones that you've been shown. And all that remains of it is this railing, the top and bottom rungs being composed of old streetcar track, which is how they made the railings for the stops here. And from this juncture on, you would be moving toward DeVue Park, and then you would cross Sleepy Hollow on a little viaduct, move into Fort Wright, and then into Fort Mitchell.
Well, you could get on the streetcar in downtown Covington, and you could pay the fare, and you could transfer at any point you wanted along the line. So you could take the train out of Covington and the streetcar out of Covington, and you could go all the way out to the end of the line in Fort Mitchell. And many people actually did that. It was kind of a way of getting out on a warm summer day or a spring day or a fall day, and just taking a ride. Instead of doing it in a car, you bought a streetcar ticket and you just transferred wherever you wanted to. So it really did connect Northern Kentucky in a way that was very novel. And when people didn't travel nearly as much, it was a very affordable way of getting out of where you normally lived and seeing other parts of the region. And so people were doing that. I remember my dad grew up in the 1930s and 40s, and he would say, for fun, when he was a boy, a couple of his buddies and them would, buy tickets in Ludlow, transfer in Covington, and go all the way out to the fort, or they would go all the way out to the end of the line in Fort Mitchell and then come back. It was just a fun thing to do on a weekend day or or an evening. The original form of cruising. So those streetcar lines were laid in very specific ways to meet very specific needs. But as the automobile started becoming more affordable, the need for as many cars and the need for the number of routes was decreasing. You start seeing cities wanting some of that space back. When you think about it, the streetcars took up a lot of space on the main roads. And they had the overhead lines that were also, some saw them as an eyesore, some just, they wanted to clean up things and kind of make the city look a little bit better. And so the movement towards buses, gas buses, became very popular.
The big flood of 1937 was bad news for the streetcars because it shut down the streetcar system, not just because of the flooding, but because of the electrical aspects of the streetcars. And so the buses were much more agile in getting around then and later. And so it was something of the death knell of the streetcars as the go-to conveyance for passengers in Northern Kentucky.
By the end of the 1930s, basically the streetcars are dying. During World War I and World War II, actually, the number of people riding the streetcar increased because more people were working, women were returning to work or industry, and so the amount of traffic going back and forth between residential neighborhoods and where the manufacturing plants were located actually increased. And so during the wartime effort had a positive impact on the streetcar system for a brief period of time. Probably extended the life of the streetcars for a few more years. Also throughout the country, which I think is very interesting, is that many of these private companies, transportation companies that were running streetcars, were bought by the automobile industry and then shut down. So the automobile industry was making a very specific financial decision to replace the streetcars, the electric streetcars, with gas buses because that was, a profit for them. That was a way of making money. And so we start in the 1930s seeing a rapid decrease in the number of people using the streetcars and more people using gas buses. And then the cities were requesting that those gas buses replace the streetcars. Those odd medians that you see along the Dixie Highway, if you're looking closely, you can see where the tracks were laid at one time. Some of those rails are still there. Some of them were dug up during World War II for scrap metal. Many of them are still there. They were just asphalted over. When you think when the original streetcar lines were laid, most of those streets were brick, or not even brick, they were dirt. And so when they started using asphalt to do the streets, It was just easier to cover the tracks than it was to dig them up. And so many times those main streets throughout northern Kentucky that had streetcar lines, the lines are still there, they're just under asphalt. And about 50 years or 60 years worth of asphalt.
I think the legacy is the visions from the mayors in the 60s and 70s that instead of developing the trolley line, they really made sure that they kept that as a green space. And we've had a lot of conversation about the trees, in the green space, and making sure that as they're maturing or anything else, we've done tree replacement programs just to really make sure that that's the legacy, is making sure that that trolley line stays beautiful along the Fort Mitchell-Dixie Highway.
Some are here for the bounty, some are here for the show. Pay the fare before you walk in, lock the door when you go. On those dead rails, you're on the wrong trail and your benefit. Been riding down the dead rails too slow.
Again, this car last ran in July of 1950, and there was a very special procession, a little parade of streetcars led by this car. And it came over the suspension bridge and came out through Fort Mitchell, out to the end of the line up near Orphanage Road and the Greyhound Tavern. And it was a pretty special event.
So after the final run of the streetcar system in northern Kentucky, it was decided that that part of our history needed to be preserved, and the Transit Authority of Northern Kentucky stepped up. They were the successor to the Green Line Streetcar Company. And so Tank decided that they were going to restore the original streetcar. That was done, and then they started looking for a home. So they wanted it to be on display. And the Behringer Crawford Museum was an obvious choice. And so it was a really good fit. A large portion of the addition on the first floor was devoted specifically to transportation and to the streetcar system. It's a very interactive piece in the museum, and it's a really great tie back to those streetcar days and that form of transportation in northern Kentucky. I think the streetcars in many ways tied northern Kentucky together, not only in a physical way, so it linked communities, but it also linked people within communities. And so people were riding the streetcars with the same people they did every day. And so, it was a community building experience. People would sit and talk, letting someone do the driving for you, sitting back, relaxing, reading the newspaper, talking with your neighbors, talking with your friends. An experience where you got together and just, were part of the community. And so I think that nostalgia harkens back to a simpler time. We're probably never going to see in northern Kentucky again that experience of so many people getting on a streetcar and going to work or going to play or, just hanging out with one another, The experience of riding a streetcar was something that people just don't forget.
Got to ride on the Fort Mitchell trolley train with a dream that I stayed and damn near didn't come back again. Didn't go very fast on the Fort Mitchell trolley train. We went down Dixie and then back again. Sitting in the old Kentucky car watching them crowds go by. Glad to have Motorman Morton on the rails. Rather be living in this town, she always has been pretty. On a genuine old electric power, #1 train. Well, I wish I was a motorman on the Fort Mitchell trolley train. Well, I drive that trolley to town and then back again. Well, I'd wear a blue hat. It says Fort Mitchell trolley train. Passengers going